Welcome everyone to The Stateless Atheist, where religion, politics, and society collide. This is going to be the first episode of what I call the Stateless Atheist Summaries. In these episodes, I will be summarizing articles and books that have influenced my thinking, and I hope they influence your thinking too. After I summarize them, I'm going to give thoughts on whatever work I summarized. Today, I'm going to be discussing Roderick Long's essay, Toward a Libertarian Theory of Class. I will be using an abridged version of the article from the book Social Class and State Power, which is edited by David Hart, Gary Chartier, Ross Kenyon, and Roderick Long. This article is going to discuss different views of the class structure within society, from ancient until modern times. Well, let's not wait any longer and start digging into this gem. Long starts off by stating it quite bluntly: libertarianism needs a theory of class. He knows there's going to be many people that argue that class and class conflict is a purely Marxian concept. He also understands that many will argue that while class theory is important, it is unnecessary in libertarian thought because it already has a good one. He rejects both of these arguments. For the first argument, he mentions that there are many varieties of class theory besides Marxist, and they go back even longer than Marxist concept. The second, he believes, is a little more difficult because they are correct. There are numerous versions of class theory already in libertarian thought. But he believes they are not adequate, and this article is his attempt to solve at least some of those shortcomings. In this section, Long starts by explaining that in order to have a libertarian theory of class, we first need to define what we mean by libertarianism and also what we mean by class. For the use of this essay, he defines libertarianism as any political position that advocates a radical redistribution of power from the coercive state to voluntary associations of free individuals. Yes, there's going to be people who disagree with this definition, because this definition is going to include political ideologies that many people feel are not libertarian at all. But he feels it is the best fit for his essay. So let's hear him out. His definition is quite inclusive, since he does not specify whether the redistribution of power is all or just some, or in what form this distribution of power to people occurs. This means that both minarchists and anarchists are included, and both socialists and capitalists can be included if they aim to redistribute the power away from the state. He goes on to describe three distinct groups of libertarians: LibCaps, LibSocs, and LibPops. LibCaps, or libertarian capitalists, have pretty much monopolized the term in contemporary usage for a libertarian. This form of libertarian can be based on either natural rights or socially beneficial outcomes. They uphold the rights of people to do as they please with their lives and justly acquired property. They further support the spontaneous order of the market over the coercive order of the state. LibCaps that want to restrict the state down to night watchmen are called minarchists, while the ones who want to eliminate the state entirely are called ANCAPs. LibSocs, or libertarian socialists, agree with LibCaps on the freedom of thought, expression, and choice of lifestyle, but disagree on the right to engage in market transactions, or on the private ownership of property. They believe that private property is another form of oppression and is antithetical to freedom. However, they are also against state control, unlike other socialist groups, and prefer decentralized forms of governance. It may surprise many people on the right because LibSocs have been using the term libertarian for at least as long as LibCaps have, if not longer. LibSocs often make the same claim to the right to use the term libertarian over LibCaps, but they both come out of the radical movements of the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries. The hostility that LibCaps and LibSocs have for one another is at least partly wrong, because they each view their opponent's camp as exclusively the authoritarian wing of that group. This isn't totally inaccurate, though, as both parties tend to downplay the problems of their authoritarian wings. LibSocs may downplay the Marxist regimes that have existed, or are willing to accept Bernie today. And LibCaps often make excuses for the Reagan and Thatcher imperialism, or more recently, the Trump administration. Now, we turn to the third group of libertarians that long identified, the LibPops, or Libertarian Populists. They tend to be traditionalists, and they do not use the term libertarian, but they fit Long's definition of aiming to redistribute the power from the state to the people. They agree with LibCaps on private property, the market, and the right to bear arms, but they are fearful of free trade, immigration, and finance capitalism. Similar to capitalists and socialists, they also have their own authoritarian wing. The authoritarian wing of populism opposes state power only because they want to institute their own power structure within the state. As already mentioned, theories of class have a rich tradition. In the Western tradition, this analysis begins in ancient Greece and Rome. Long refers to this tradition as the Republican theory of class. These theories juxtaposed the wealthy minority versus the poor majority. Both groups had power, with the former because of its wealth and the latter because of its size. They believed for any political system to succeed, it must meet the needs of both groups. These theories did not agree with how to meet these needs, though. The conservatives of the day favored a mixed constitution consistent of a mix of aristocracy and democracy. Obviously, the liberals disagreed. They believed that the conservatives underestimated the influence the wealthy class had on the democratic system and overestimated the influence of the poor. While these two groups disagreed, they both believed the constitutional design should aim to achieve a balance between the two classes. The latter theories on class used these ancient ideas as their base. Then, in the 18th century, two much more radical theories of class emerged. These new ideas diverged from the classical Republican idea by recognizing one group as purely exploitative and another as exploited. And the methods for dealing with this exploitive class was to try to eliminate it, as opposed to meeting its needs. These two groups will respectively be called the Smithian and the Rousseauian theories of class. The Rousseauian theory began with Jean-Jacques Rousseau and later adopted by Marx. Similar to the Republican antecedent, it is based on economic status. In this view, socioeconomic inequality inherently leads to a class of oppressors and oppressed, which it is skeptical of any reliable constitutional safeguards against. On the other hand, the Smithian theory began with Adam Smith and continued on with Jean-Baptiste Say, Thomas Jefferson, and Lysander Spooner. Both the supporters of and enemies of Smith often accuse him of being a defender of business interests. Smith was a lot more nuanced than that. He was a defender of capitalism at the expense of capitalists, and he favored the laborer over the mercantilist class. Here is where he diverged from the Rousseauian view. Economic inequality itself was not at fault, but the ability of the wealthy to exert extra influence over society. So it wasn't their economic status to blame, but their unequal ability to influence the state. Since, according to Smithians, the nexus of the power is the state, they would argue to reduce or eliminate the state. Rousseauians viewing the market as the creator of power, they naturally wanted to regulate or eliminate the market. LibCaps, when thinking about class, often adopt some form of the Smithian view, while both LibSocs and LibPops use the Rousseauian view. Long starts off this section by defining what he calls statocrats and plutocrats. What he is doing here is separating the ruling class into two subdivisions: the statocrats, or the agents of the state, and the plutocrats, who are the people who garner privilege through manipulating the state. If you view the world as containing a ruling class and accept Long's definitions, then there are only 5 possibilities of arrangements that are possible: statocracy only, plutocracy only, statocracy dominant, plutocracy dominant, and neither dominant. Where statocracy only means that the oppressive class is 100% the state actors, plutocracy only is that the rich and elite are the oppressors and the state isn't. Statocracy dominant means they are both oppressors but the state is dominant. Plutocracy dominant means that they are both oppressors but the elite are dominant. And finally, neither dominant means both the statocrats and plutocrats are equal in their oppression. For the plutocracy-only position, we would need to believe that the state is benign or always beneficial. They just have not overcome the power of the plutocrats yet. This is a view held often, but not by libertarians, as one of a libertarian's primary concerns is the oppression by the state. A better view is what Long calls plutocracy dominant. In this view, the state is oppressive due to the influence of the plutocrats. LibSocs and LibPops often take the plutocracy dominant view. They believe without the influence of the market, then the state would be, at least, mostly benign. Public choice economics has created doubt with the plutocracy only by showing that the state actors respond to incentives the same way that private actors do. While many LibSocs believe the state would be benign without the influence of the market, not all of them do. When Marx suggested the dictatorship of the proletariat as the transitional stage between capitalism and anarcho-communism, he was taken to task by Bakunin for this naive view. And I quote, "This question arises: if the proletariat is ruling, over whom will it rule? If there exists a state, there is inevitably domination and slavery. What does it mean for the proletariat to be organized as the ruling class? Can it really be that the entire proletariat will stand at the head of the administration? There are about 40 million Germans. Will all 40 million be members of the government? The entire nation will be governors and there will be no governed ones? Then there will be no government, no state. But if there is a state, there will be governors and slaves. So in sum, government of the great majority of popular masses by a privileged minority. But this minority of will be composed of workers, says the Marxists. Of former workers, perhaps, but just as soon as they become representatives or rulers of the people, they will cease to be workers. And they'll start looking down on ordinary workers from the heights of the state. They will now represent not the people, but themselves, and their claims to govern people. He who doubts this simply does not know human nature. They say that a state yoke, a dictatorship, is a necessary transitional means for attaining the most complete popular liberation. So to liberate the masses of the people, they first have to be enslaved. They maintain that only a dictatorship can have any other aim than to perpetuate itself, and it can only give rise to and instill slavery in the people that tolerate it." End quote. With major problems in the plutocracy only and the plutocracy dominant positions, is statocracy only a viable opinion? LibCaps sometimes hold this position. Ayn Rand even called big business a persecuted minority and ignored the existence of the military-industrial complex. She has, however, acknowledged the history of big businesses using the state for privileges. Unfortunately, she generally viewed big business influence as benign, placing her in the camp of statocracy only. Contemporary research of American history from both the LibSoc and the LibCap position call this into question. Big business was often the agents calling the state to action to gain political favors. Many of the businesses who originally created their wealth through economic means resorted to political ones they were on top. It is important for libertarians to recognize both the existence of statocrats and plutocrats. The interests of these two classes often align, but they also come into conflict with one another and grapple for control. When the plutocracy gains the upper hand, it turns into authoritarian capitalism, but when the statocracy gains the upper hand, it turns into authoritarian socialism. As we have detailed in the last section, there is a large swath of views on how the ruling class gets or maintains its power. Plutocracy only is pretty much rejected by anyone who identifies with libertarian ideas, as libertarianism, like Long identified in the first section, is about gaining power back from the state. The plutocracy dominant and neither dominant positions are mostly monopolized by the LibSocs and LibPops. Statocracy dominant is believed across the spectrum from LibSocs, LibPops, and LibCaps. Lastly, statocracy only is pretty much only believed by LibCaps. Plutocracy only, plutocracy dominant, and statocracy only have pretty much been put to rest by empirical observation. This leaves statocracy dominant and neither dominant standing. So which position should libertarians adopt? Long believes that neither is adequate. The statocracy dominant position underestimates, while the neither dominant overestimates the ability of the wealthy elites to maintain dominance in the absence of government favoritism. Long believes the truth of reality lies between the two, in what he calls statocracy mostly dominant. Why is the statocracy dominant position not viable? For starters, it has little historical validity. During ancient Greek and Roman times, the governments were quite weak and decentralized, but the rich elite still managed to maintain dominance. This is true of medieval Iceland also, which had decentralized political institutions. According to historian Moses Finley, the rich kept its control by buying off the poor. In the work Discourse of Voluntary Servitude of the 17th century political theorist Etienne de la Bataille, argued that no government can muster enough coercive force to subdue an unwilling populace, and must rely on some form of patronage. So the problem with the statocracy dominant view is that since patronage seems to be an effective tool for maintaining class dominance with or without a state, the rich may still be able to maintain their privileges by buying off the poor and maybe use their power to reestablish a state. The neither dominant view has its own shortcomings, because the statocracy dominant view has some truth to it. The state maintains the power of the elites through minimum wage laws, zoning laws, rent control laws, and other regulations to make it more expensive to survive, which this keeps the poor dependent upon the state. Even many tax laws and economic regulations help to entrench the big corporations by keeping out their competition. Furthermore, the power of the state greatly increases the power of the rich. Imagine if Daddy Warbucks wanted to achieve some goal that cost $1 million. Without the state, he would need to bear the full cost, but with the state, he has the option of lobbying the state for subsidies. When we view all the ways the state gives power to the rich, it is hard to argue completely against the statocracy dominant view. How might we go about combating this power imbalance? LibSocs and LibPops are willing to use the power of the state to achieve this ends. But history shows the use of the state, even if initially of good merit, is often corrupted by the rich and elite, or by the interests of the state actors themselves, thus making the power imbalance worse. LibCaps, while they are against using the state, would be amiss by ignoring the capitalistic resources that may help combat the problem. Remember, this is only a summary. Long has many other important insights in the piece, and I would recommend reading it for yourself, as it is a wealth of ideas. There is a PDF copy linked in the description. So what are my thoughts on this article? I agree with Long about statocracy mostly dominant being the best position to hold. Let me use a few contemporary examples to support this. During the buildup of the 2008 collapse, the big banks knew that the United States has a policy of bailing out banks that are too big to fail. This policy encourages more bad investment, including Ponzi schemes, because the chances of going bankrupt, an incentive against bad investments, is eliminated. To better understand how this works, imagine someone insured your paycheck, that if you lost it during doing stupid things, wouldn't you be more likely to do those stupid things? Now imagine the government insuring the billions of dollars that the big banks have to invest. Do you think there may be an incentive problem there? Next, under the Affordable Care Act, any business that has 50 employees or more had to insure all their employees medically. At first pass, this sounds like a great way to not only help people, but also not to harm small businesses in the process. But let's think about this a little deeper. Imagine a small business that has 49 employees and wants to hire a 50th. How expensive is that 50th employee now? Not only does it include the regular cost of that employee, but also the cost of healthcare for the other 49 employees. In economics, the cost of the next unit is called the marginal cost. Now let's imagine the marginal cost of the first 49 employees were all equal at $50,000 a year each. What is the marginal cost of the 50th employee? Employers pay on average 82% of the cost of the medical insurance, which comes out to be a little less than $6,000 a year. So let's use $6,000 as the cost per employee to simplify the math. So per year, the marginal cost of that 50th employee would be $350,000. Their return on investment would have to be huge for them to accept that. This includes $300,000 for the health coverage of all the employees and the 50th employee's annual salary. Yes, there are other costs to consider, but they are not necessary for this analysis. Even if we included the other costs, the 50th employee's marginal cost would still be significantly higher. This props up the already big corporations who could afford that expense much more easily and keeps the smaller companies from competing against them. If you want to read more about the power of the state in modern times, read Randall Holcomb's great book, Political Capitalism. When it comes to the power of the plutocracy in a stateless society, I agree they can still have control over the plebeians. This is why you will see within this channel that I argue that the statelessness is necessary, but not sufficient for anarchy. It is possible for a ruling class to have control without a state. I do believe it is less likely without a state, and if they do take control without a state, they would not have as much influence as through a state, but it still can happen. Most examples that we have of medieval Iceland or Somalia today are stateless, but not anarchic. Long also talks about economic inequality as a major contributor of power that maintains the control of the rich and powerful. Along this analysis, he gives the examples the political theorist Etienne de la Bataille, where he maintains that a state cannot keep control by coercion alone. It must rely on patronage. But I believe it is more than that. If a minority of people paid the vast majority to listen to them, and they did not have coercion supporting them, why would the majority listen to the minority? I believe it is belief. The vast majority believe it is the best thing for them, the morally right thing for them, or they are indifferent. Therefore, they continue to listen to the minority. David Hume had a similar position, and I quote, "Nothing appears more surprising to those who consider human affairs with a philosophical eye than the easiness with which the many are governed by the few, and the implicit submission with which men resign their own sentiments and passion to those of their rulers. When we inquire by what means this wonder is effected, we shall find that as force is always on the side of the governors have nothing to support them but opinion. It is therefore on opinion only that the government is founded, and this maxim extends to the most despotic and most military governments, as well to the most free and most popular. The Sultan of Egypt or the Emperor of Rome might drive his harmless subjects like brute beasts against their sentiments and inclination, but he must at least have led his Mamelukes or Praetorian bands like men by their opinion. Paul Sager wrote a great book on this subject where I found that quote called The Opinion of Mankind, Sociability and the Theory of the State from Hobbes to Smith. Jacob Levy documents a tradition of classical liberal literature that questions the power of local groups in his book, Rationalism, Pluralism, and Freedom. In it, he names the group of liberals that question local groups' influence on people and wish to use the state to control them as the rationalists. While I agree with the skepticism of local groups, I diverge on the use of the state as the means to fix the problem. As we have seen both in Long's essay and in so many other places, giving control to the state usually results in worse outcomes due to the incentive problem and the knowledge problem. I do, however, agree with the position of Will Kymlicka in Levy's book. He says that Kymlicka maintains that liberal principles entail cultural minorities have the right to maintain themselves as cultures, but also entail that they do not have the right to inhibit the autonomy of their members with internally illiberal norms. He identified this as the liberal idea of toleration. He later described Susan Moller Oken's worry about the ways the culture and religious minorities inculcate sexist views, including among their female members, and suggested that women's freedom would be best served if these traditional communities became extinct. I can talk about these ideas for hours more, but I think this is enough to sink our teeth into for now. Please comment below where do you fit. Are you statocracy dominant, plutocracy dominant, or one of the other positions? Tell me why, and if you think either Long or I are wrong about anything. This channel is about me teaching, but it's also about me learning. I want to learn from my audience and the videos that I create for you. So please, if you're going to argue against me or add to what I say, if you have a source, please provide it. Goodbye. Thank you everyone for joining me. Please like and subscribe. I'll see you soon.